I'm Father Chuck Lienert. It's a great pleasure for me to be here because this is a parish I grew up in. I'm a graduate from St. John's School, and over 50 years ago I celebrated my first Mass right here in this church. So I have long ties. We're getting towards the end of Ordinary Time, and this year we've been reading Luke's Gospel. Jesus has been on a journey in this gospel from up north in Galilee all the way to Jerusalem. Last Sunday he was in the last stop, Jericho. Remember Zacchaeus, the tax collector who was overwhelmed with Jesus and said he'd give half his money to the poor, and if he cheated anyone, he'd pay him back 4 times. Remember that? So now Jesus is at the last stop, Jerusalem, where he predicted 3 times on the journey that he would be tortured, killed, and would rise. And he's in the temple area. The temple area was a big square, it was 36 acres. And around this square that enclosed the temple was a wall, and inside the wall was a covered portico. That's most likely where Jesus was teaching. During his whole journey, there had been a growing conflict with the religious authorities. So chapter 20, which we read from this morning, is all about the conflict between the authorities and Jesus. So right at the beginning of the chapter, they come and they say, "By whose authority are you teaching?" Jesus didn't answer them. Instead, he asked them, "By whose authority did John the Baptist teach? Answer that and I'll answer you." They couldn't answer it. If they said by God's authority, the response would be, "Well, why didn't you follow him?" If he said just by the authority of human beings, the people would have been outraged. Then Jesus told a little parable about rejection, the tenant farmers, and they knew it was directed right at them, and they were determined to grab a hold of him and get rid of him, but they didn't dare. Instead, they sent some embassies to try to trap him with another question. And they said, "Is it legal, good teacher? We know you're wise. Is it legal to pay taxes to Rome, to the emperor?" Thinking that if he said yes, they would say, "Well, he's complicit with Rome." And if he said no, they would say, "Well, he's against the emperor." Jesus said, "Well, show me a coin." They took out a denarius. The denarius was a Roman coin. It had a picture of Caesar, Tiberius Caesar on it. And the inscription said, "Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus." And he said, "Whose picture is that?" "Well, Caesar." Says, "And then give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." Now, by having that very Roman coin, they were already involved with the Roman economy. Finally, another group, these were the conservatives. We read about them just a few moments ago, the Sadducees. They were conservative in this sense. They didn't accept the resurrection or the teaching about angels because those had developed within the last 200 years in the Jewish tradition. And the belief in the resurrection from the dead was a late belief in Judaism. The Sadducees didn't accept it. So they tried to trap Jesus with a story of a woman that was married to 7 different brothers, following a law in the Old Testament. And they asked him, "Well, who's she married to if there's a resurrection?" And Jesus' answer was, "You just don't understand that the next life is different than this life. In the end of the chapter 20, Jesus calls out the real motives of the people that were trying to trap him with questions and trying to get rid of him. They said, "Be on guard against the scribes who like to go around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplace, seats of honor in the synagogues, and places of honor at banquets. They devour the houses of widows and, as a pretext, recite lengthy prayers. They will receive a very severe condemnation." So I'm going to comment maybe in terms of today about two things in these readings. One is about the conflict between the authorities, the religious authorities, at least some of them, and Jesus. First of all, in questioning Jesus, they were not at all interested in learning the truth, or at least learning what Jesus thought and why he taught what he did. Their interest was in destroying him. And the second thing is their motives were to protect their own privilege and their corruption, as Jesus pointed out at the end of that chapter. Now, I think it's a great lesson for us today, because so much of our public discourse and our private discourse too is not about seeking truth. It's not about building a relationship with someone else. It's about destroying the other person. It's about putting someone down. And the second thing, often the topic of the discussion or the argument is not the real issue. There's a deeper issue that people are protecting, and it's probably something in their self-interest. So I think we can learn a lesson from what Jesus experienced in his journey to Jerusalem, and ultimately what happened in Jerusalem. We need to be different. We need to talk to one another so that we can learn from each other, so that we can at least have some empathy why the other person believes or thinks what he or she does. We need to love the people we disagree with. We need to be conscious of our own self-interests and how much they're affecting what we say. The second thing I want to comment on is the notion of the resurrection. It was obvious that the Maccabees, in the Maccabees that we read, the brothers were willing to suffer torture and death rather than disobey the law of God. One of the reasons they had that strength was their belief in a resurrection after this life. As one of them said. But our belief in the resurrection is not based on some ideological thought. It's based on the experience of those disciples that witnessed the risen Christ. They were in despair after the crucifixion, and yet he appeared in the upper room. He appeared first to Mary in the garden. He appeared to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. He appeared to the disciples on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And it was from those personal experiences of the risen Lord that our belief in the resurrection is based. It is what Paul preached. He himself said he was the least of the apostles, but he had also witnessed the risen Lord. So our belief in the resurrection should change the way we live. Because the end is not this life. It's a new life. It's a life of communion with God, and that necessarily involves a communion with God's people. It is exactly what we celebrate at Mass. When we receive communion, it's not just communion with the Trinity. It's not just receiving the body and blood of Christ. And through the Holy Spirit, we are then brought into communion with one another. So we are actually people of the resurrection. That's what our life is about life. It's about love. It's about relationships. That's what we celebrate and realize at Mass this morning.